Case 1, Ann Miller Kontz. College sweethearts don't always live happily ever after. Sometimes, they become headlines for all the wrong reasons. Ann Miller and Eric Miller looked like the perfect American couple. They met at Purdue University in the early 1990s, both brilliant chemistry students with promising futures ahead. Ann was blonde, organized, and driven. Eric was athletic, kind-hearted, and dedicated to fighting pediatric AIDS through his research at the University of North Carolina. By 2000, they had a beautiful home in Raleigh, a toddler daughter, and careers that colleagues envied. But beneath the polished surface, something far darker was brewing. In November 2000, Eric began experiencing mysterious flu-like symptoms. After bowling one evening with colleagues, he felt violently ill and was rushed to the hospital. Doctors initially couldn't identify the cause. He recovered enough to return home, but 2 weeks later, the symptoms returned with devastating force. This time, medical tests revealed something chilling. Eric's body was flooded with arsenic. Despite desperate efforts to save him, Eric Miller died on December 2nd, 2000, at just 30 years old. Investigators immediately suspected foul play. The couple's colleagues at GlaxoSmithKline, where Ann worked as a research scientist, confirmed both she and a coworker named Daryl Willard had access to arsenic in their laboratory. What's more, witnesses came forward describing Ann's affair with Willard, an affair that had been ongoing even as Eric lay dying in his hospital bed. The evidence pointed toward a conspiracy, but proving it would take years. Daryl Willard became the focal point of the investigation. Police questioned him extensively about his relationship with Ann and his access to toxic compounds. But before authorities could build their case, Willard was found dead in his garage from a self-inflicted wound in January 2001. He left behind a suicide note proclaiming innocence, but his attorney held a secret that would eventually crack the case wide open. For nearly 4 years, Ann Miller moved on with her life. She remarried a Christian rock musician named Paul Kontz, relocated to Wilmington with her daughter, and seemed to escape justice entirely. Investigators remained convinced she had orchestrated her husband's demise, but without solid evidence, their hands were tied. Then in 2004, the North Carolina Supreme Court made a landmark ruling that changed everything. The court ordered Willard's attorney, Rick Gammon, to reveal confidential information Willard had shared before his death. Gammon disclosed that Willard had met Ann in a parking lot shortly after Eric's hospitalization. According to Willard, Ann admitted taking a syringe from her purse and injecting its contents into Eric's IV line while alone in his hospital room. When Willard asked why, she simply replied that she didn't know. This confession became the breakthrough prosecutors desperately needed. In September 2004, a grand jury indicted Ann Miller Kontz for first-degree murder. She was arrested and faced the possibility of capital punishment. For the Miller family, Eric's parents, siblings, and young daughter, the indictment brought both relief and renewed anguish. They had waited nearly 4 years for someone to be held accountable. During proceedings, prosecutors painted a picture of calculated cruelty. They argued Ann had poisoned Eric at least twice. Once by lacing his beer at the bowling alley, and again by injecting arsenic directly into his IV. The motive appeared financial. She stood to benefit from substantial life insurance policies. Defense attorneys countered that the case relied heavily on hearsay from a deceased witness, but the evidence was damning. In November 2005, rather than face trial, Ann Miller Kontz accepted a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. In a barely audible voice before the court, she admitted causing Eric's death. The Miller family confronted her during sentencing, demanding answers she could not provide. Eric's sister asked why Ann couldn't even look at them. His mother spoke of a pain that would never heal. Through it all, Ann remained silent, offering only a written statement expressing remorse. judge sentenced her to between 25 and 31 years in prison. She would not be eligible for release until well into her 50s. As of today, Ann Miller Kontz remains incarcerated at Noose Correctional Institution in Goldsboro, North Carolina, serving her sentence for a crime that destroyed 2 families and left a little girl without her father. Eric Miller's legacy lives on through his research and the memories of those who loved him. His family established scholarships in his name and continues advocating for justice in cases where trust is weaponized. Ann's calculated betrayal serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers, but from those we trust most. But if you thought a chemistry degree was the deadliest weapon in North Carolina, wait until you hear about the former law enforcement officer who turned his training against innocent students. Case 2, Craig Stephen Hicks. When 3 promising young lives were extinguished in a Chapel Hill apartment, the world demanded answers, but the truth proved more complex than anyone imagined. On February 10th, 2015, emergency responders arrived at the Finley Forest condominium complex near Chapel Hill to find a scene of unimaginable horror. Inside a modest apartment lay the bodies of 3 Muslim students. Daya Shadi Barakat, 23, a second-year dental student at UNC. His wife of 6 weeks, Yusor Muhammad Abu Salha, 21. And her sister, Razan Muhammad Abu Salha, 19, an undergraduate at North Carolina State University. All 3 had been shot multiple times in the head at close range. The executions were swift, methodical, and devastating. Within hours, a suspect turned himself in. Craig Stephen Hicks, 46, lived in the same complex and had a notorious reputation for confronting neighbors over parking spaces and noise. He surrendered to authorities in nearby Pittsburgh, still carrying the .357 caliber handgun that ballistics would later match to shell casings found at the scene. What followed was a national conversation about hate crimes, religious bias, and whether justice could truly be served. Hicks fit no easy profile. A former auto parts salesman turned paralegal student, he was known for his obsessive complaints about parking regulations and his vocal atheism on social media. His Facebook page contained hundreds of anti-religion posts, attacking all faiths equally. Neighbors described him as aggressive and unpredictable, someone who patrolled the parking lot like a vigilante and confronted residents while openly carrying firearms. Multiple people reported feeling threatened by his behavior long before that fatal February evening. The victims' families immediately characterized the incident as a hate crime. Dr. Muhammad Abu Salha, father of the 2 sisters, described how Hicks had previously confronted family members while they wore hijabs, making it clear he didn't like the look of them. Witnesses confirmed Hicks had shown particular hostility toward the Muslim residents, threatening violence, while his conflicts with white neighbors rarely escalated beyond verbal disputes. To the families, this wasn't about parking, it was about prejudice. Chapel Hill police initially framed the incident as a dispute over parking spaces, a narrative that sparked international outrage. How could 3 young people be executed over something so trivial? Protests erupted across multiple continents, with vigils held everywhere from Gaza City to Doha. President Obama eventually weighed in, calling for tolerance and understanding. The case became a flashpoint for discussions about Islamophobia in America. Then came the evidence that changed everything. In 2019, during plea negotiations, prosecutors revealed that Daya Barakat had recorded his own final moments on his cell phone. The 36-second video showed Hicks arriving at the door, complaining about parking spaces before immediately opening fire. The footage captured screams from Yusor and Razan as they pleaded for their lives. It was devastating proof that contradicted Hicks's claims of self-defense and confirmed the calculated nature of his actions. Further investigation revealed Hicks's troubling psychological state. His ex-wife told prosecutors he was obsessed with the movie Falling Down, about a frustrated man who responds to dysfunction with escalating violence. Mental health evaluations found evidence of paranoia and anger management issues, though he was deemed competent to stand trial. The combination of religious bias, firearms obsession, and unchecked rage created a perfect storm. In June 2019, after years of legal maneuvering, Craig Stephen Hicks pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. He also admitted to discharging a firearm into an occupied dwelling. His plea came after the district attorney dropped plans to seek the death penalty in exchange for expediting the case. Hicks received 3 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, plus additional time for the weapons charge. During sentencing, family members delivered powerful victim impact statements. Dea's sister, Dr. Suzanne Barakat, called the murders an Islamophobic hate crime and labeled it a terrorist attack. She spoke of dreams destroyed, weddings that would never happen, and children who would never be born. Usor had just been accepted to dental school and planned to follow her husband into a career helping underserved communities. Razan had made the dean's list and was passionate about architecture and charity work. All 3 had organized fundraisers for Syrian refugees and volunteered helping the homeless. The families expressed frustration that federal authorities never pursued hate crime charges, despite what they saw as overwhelming evidence of bias. While North Carolina's hate crime laws only covered misdemeanors at the time, federal prosecutors said they couldn't establish sufficient evidence to meet the higher legal threshold. This legal technicality left many feeling that justice remained incomplete. Chapel Hill Police Chief Chris Blue later expressed regret for the department's initial emphasis on the parking dispute narrative, acknowledging it minimized the hateful nature of the crime. The case prompted universities across North Carolina to re-examine campus safety protocols and implement stronger protections against bias incidents. Today, Craig Hicks remains imprisoned, serving out 3 lifetimes for taking 3 lives. The victims are memorialized through scholarships, charitable foundations, and the continued advocacy of their families, who transform tragedy into action. Dea's fundraising campaign for Syrian dental relief, which had raised only $3,000 before his death, swelled to nearly $300,000 afterward. Proof that even in darkness, compassion can prevail. But while some killers target strangers driven by ideology, others destroy the people they once promised to love, as one Carolina Panthers player would discover too late. Case 3. Deidra Lane. When a rising NFL star was found dead in his own home, investigators faced a question that shattered the image of domestic harmony. Who pulls the trigger when love turns lethal? Fred Lane was living the American dream. At 24, the Carolina Panthers running back had established himself as one of the franchise's most promising talents, racking up over 2,000 rushing yards in just 3 seasons. Undrafted out of Lane College in Tennessee, he'd proven doubters wrong and earned a trade to the Indianapolis Colts. Off the field, he projected confidence and success, a young man who'd beaten the odds and built a future. But on July 6th, 2000, that future ended in a burst of violence that left his family, teammates, and fans searching for answers. The emergency call came from Fred's own home in Charlotte. When police arrived at the residence on that summer afternoon, they found Fred's body just inside the front door, his keys still in the lock, and his bags nearby, as if he'd just arrived. He'd been shot twice with a 12-gauge shotgun, once in the chest as he entered, and again in the back of the head as he lay dying. The calculated nature of the wounds told investigators this was no accident or crime of panic. Someone had waited for him. That someone was his wife, Deidra Lane. 25 years old and distraught, she made the 911 call herself, claiming Fred had been shot because he wouldn't leave me alone. Investigators immediately noted inconsistencies in her story. Evidence suggested she had positioned herself to ambush Fred as he walked through the door, then stepped through his blood to deliver the fatal second shot. It was methodical, deliberate, and according to prosecutors, motivated by greed. The Lanes' marriage had been troubled from the start. Many who knew them believed they'd only married because Deidra became pregnant, not out of genuine affection. Friends and teammates described Fred as generous, but increasingly trapped in a relationship marked by conflict. 2 weeks before his death, Deidra had fired a gun through a wall during an argument, a warning sign that police now viewed as a rehearsal for what came next. Financial issues added another dimension to the investigation. Fred's father revealed his son had been asking friends for small loans, claiming he was broke despite his NFL salary. When Fred inquired about the couple's finances, Deidra had supposedly told him the money was with a financial planner, but when Fred called, the planner had no record of receiving anything. The money trail led investigators to suspect Deidra had been draining their accounts while setting up a far more permanent solution to her marital problems. Prosecutors built their case around life insurance policies worth up to $5 million, with Deidra as the beneficiary. They also uncovered her involvement in a separate bank larceny case from 1998, where she'd conspired with a teller to steal $41,000 from a Wachovia branch. The pattern painted a picture of someone willing to break any rule for financial gain. Even her brother was later convicted of multiple bank robberies and sentenced to over a century behind bars. Deidra's defense team presented a dramatically different narrative. They portrayed her as a victim of domestic violence, trapped in an abusive marriage with a man who allegedly beat her while she was pregnant, threw her downstairs, and threatened her repeatedly. They argued the shooting was self-defense, that Fred had dragged her by the hair and was coming after her when she grabbed the shotgun in desperation. Character witnesses spoke of Fred's alleged temper and substance issues, though his family vehemently denied these claims. The case took 3 years to reach trial. Initially charged with first-degree murder and facing the death penalty, Deidra eventually accepted a plea agreement in November 2003. She pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, acknowledging she'd caused Fred's death. The deal spared her from a potential capital sentence, but guaranteed significant prison time. During sentencing, prosecutors reminded the court that this was no heat-of-the-moment tragedy. The evidence showed premeditation, waiting with a loaded shotgun, firing twice, walking through blood to ensure the job was finished. Fred's family members delivered emotional statements describing a loving son and father whose only crime was marrying the wrong person. His father said Deidra was only sorry she'd been caught. The judge sentenced Deidra Lane to between 7 years and 11 months, and 9 years and 8 months in prison. She served nearly 6 years before being released in March 2009. Her early release sparked renewed anger from Fred's family, who felt justice had been inadequate for a crime that took a young father from his children and deprived the NFL community of a rising talent. Today, Deidra Lane lives quietly, far from the spotlight that once followed her husband. Fred Lane is remembered through charitable foundations and the memories of teammates who speak of his determination and kindness. The case remains a cautionary tale about the dangerous intersection of domestic violence, financial desperation, and easy access to firearms. In the end, the woman who claimed to be a victim ensured there could be no other side to the story. Yet, domestic violence isn't always what it seems. As another case would prove, when a routine wellness check uncovered evidence of crimes far worse than anyone imagined. Case 4, Robert Jason Owens. When neighbors reported seeing a man dumping suspicious bags into a dumpster, no one could have predicted the investigation would uncover one of North Carolina's most disturbing cases. Or linked to a 15-year-old cold case that had haunted Asheville for years. In March 2015, Christy Schoen Codd and her husband Joseph J.T. Codd were preparing for the next chapter of their lives. Christy, 38 and 5 months pregnant, had competed on Season 8 of the Next Food Network Star and provided catering services on film sets. J.T., 45, worked behind the scenes in television and movie production. The couple had recently settled in Leicester, North Carolina, west of Asheville, hiring local contractors to help renovate their new home. One of those contractors was Robert Jason Owens, 36, a handyman who lived nearby and seemed eager to help. On March 14th, family members grew concerned when Christy failed to arrive in Mississippi as expected. Phone calls went unanswered. When relatives reached the Codd home, they found the couple's dogs, Christy's purse, and JT's wallet, but no sign of the Codds themselves. Worried friends contacted the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office, launching an investigation that would soon take a horrifying turn. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A local resident reported seeing Owens dumping large garbage bags into a dumpster on Donna Drive in the days following the Codds' disappearance. When investigators located those bags, they discovered items belonging to Christy, including her identification. This led detectives directly to Owens, who initially claimed to know nothing about the couple's whereabouts. Under questioning on March 16th, Owens' story began to fall apart. He eventually admitted to authorities that he'd been involved in the Codds' deaths, though his explanation strained credibility. According to Owens, his truck had become stuck in a creek near the Codd property. When JT and Christy came to help push the vehicle free, Owens claimed he accidentally hit the accelerator, running over both of them. He said he panicked, knowing he wasn't supposed to be driving due to a previous conviction, and feared returning to prison. What happened next defied comprehension. Rather than call for help, Owens said he carried Christy's body into the house and attempted first aid before she died. He then transported JT's body to his own property and burned it in a wood stove. The following day, he returned to the Codd home, moved Christy's body to the shower, and dismembered it with tools before burning those remains as well. He continued this process over several days, methodically destroying evidence of what prosecutors would argue was murder, not an accident. During those days, Owens took steps to create a cover story. He used Christy's phone to send text messages to family members, claiming the couple was sick and wouldn't be able to travel. He sold the Codds' belongings and used the proceeds to fill his truck with gas and take his wife out to dinner. When investigators searched Owens' property, they discovered human remains inside his wood stove that were later identified through DNA as belonging to the Codds. The case sent shockwaves through the television and culinary communities. Christy had been beloved by colleagues who remembered her generosity, including the time she rented space in Asheville to cook and provide a free Thanksgiving dinner for the entire community. Her family described someone who lived to make others happy, whose passion for cooking was matched only by her kindness. JT was remembered as a hard-working professional devoted to his craft. Together, they'd been planning for their daughter, whom they'd named Skylar. But there was another dimension to this tragedy. Robert Jason Owens had been a person of interest in the 2000 disappearance of 18-year-old Zeb Quinn, an Asheville Community College student who'd vanished after meeting Owens to look at a car. Quinn's case remained unsolved for years, with Owens consistently refusing to cooperate with investigators, despite being the last person known to have seen Quinn alive. The Codd case reignited hope that Quinn's family might finally get answers. In August 2015, the Buncombe County District Attorney announced plans to seek the death penalty against Owens. Prosecutors described the Codd case as among the most disturbing homicides in county history, noting that Owens had nearly completed the gruesome project of cremating his victims' remains by the time he was arrested. His actions showed consciousness of guilt and deliberate destruction of evidence. However, in April 2017, Owens accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder for JT, Christy, and their unborn child, Skylar, plus 2 counts of dismembering human remains. In exchange for his guilty plea, prosecutors agreed to drop the death penalty and consolidated robbery charges. The judge sentenced Owens to serve between 59 and 74 years in prison, ensuring he would likely die behind bars. During sentencing, Owens offered apologies to the victims' families, but those words rang hollow. The Schoen family released a scathing statement expressing their belief that justice had not been served, that Owens's claim of an accident was a lie, and that the plea deal was inadequate for such heinous crimes. They remained convinced that Owens had deliberately killed the Kontz, possibly over a dispute about payment or work quality, and that his elaborate disposal efforts proved premeditation. In 2022, in a surprising development, Owens pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact in Zeb Quinn's disappearance. He claimed a family member, now deceased, had shot Quinn, and that he'd witnessed the body being burned and ashes dumped near Bent Creek. While investigators couldn't corroborate his account with physical evidence, Quinn's family found some measure of closure in finally having an explanation, however incomplete. Today, Robert Jason Owens serves his sentence at a North Carolina state prison, his name synonymous with calculated cruelty. The house of horrors where he destroyed 2 families was eventually torn down, leaving only memories of what was lost. Christy and JT Codd are remembered through their work, their kindness, and the daughter who never got to be born. Yet while some crimes shock with their brutality, others haunt us because of the lies that preceded them, as North Carolina would learn when a woman who'd once made national headlines returned to the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Case 5, Crystal Mangum. Some names become synonymous with controversy, forever linked to a scandal that reshaped how America views justice, race, and truth. But what happens when that same person returns to headlines years later, this time as a convicted killer? In March 2006, Crystal Mangum stood at the center of one of the most explosive cases in modern American history. A 27-year-old student and exotic dancer, she accused 3 Duke University lacrosse players of assault during a team party. The allegations ignited a firestorm. Wealthy white students versus a black single mother. Privilege versus poverty. Duke's elite status versus Durham's working-class community. National media descended on North Carolina. The lacrosse season was canceled. The coach resigned. District Attorney Mike Nafong pursued the case aggressively, seeing it as a crusade for justice. But the foundation was built on falsehoods. DNA evidence excluded all the players. Mangum's story changed repeatedly. Investigations revealed that Nafong had withheld exculpatory evidence and made prejudicial statements to the media. In April 2007, North Carolina's Attorney General declared the players innocent, stating there was no credible evidence to support the charges. Nafong was disbarred. The university settled lawsuits. 3 young men had their reputations restored, though scars remained. And Crystal Mangum, whose accusations had upended so many lives, disappeared from the spotlight, temporarily. In February 2010, Mangum returned to police attention after an altercation with her boyfriend, Milton Walker. Authorities responded to reports of domestic violence at her Durham home. During the incident, Mangum allegedly set fire to clothing in a bathtub, threatened Walker with knives, and assaulted him in front of her children. Prosecutors charged her with attempted murder and arson, though she was ultimately convicted only of child abuse, property damage, and resisting arrest. She served 88 days. 17 months later, on April 3, 2011, emergency responders arrived at a different Durham address after receiving a frantic call. They found 46-year-old Reginald Day with a severe stab wound to his torso, bleeding heavily and struggling to remain conscious. Day had been stabbed with a kitchen knife during an argument with Mangum, who'd been staying with him. He told investigators he'd tried to get away from her when she attacked. Day was rushed to Duke University Hospital and underwent surgery for injuries to his spleen and colon. Doctors initially believed he'd recover. 10 days later, Reginald Day died. Medical examiners determined complications from the stabbing led to his death, though the exact cause would later become a source of controversy. What was clear was this: an argument between two people who'd been dating for roughly a month had escalated into fatal violence, and Crystal Mangum was charged with first-degree murder. Mangum's defense centered on self-defense. She claimed Day had been physically abusive throughout their brief relationship, that he'd dragged her by the hair and was attacking her when she grabbed the knife. Her attorneys painted a picture of a woman trapped in a cycle of domestic violence, forced to protect herself from a larger, stronger man. They argued the Duke lacrosse case had poisoned public perception against her, making it impossible for her to receive a fair trial in Durham. Prosecutors told a different story. They presented testimony from Day's family members, who described him as a hardworking tradesman, not an abuser. They called Milton Walker, Mangum's previous boyfriend, as a witness. Walker testified that Mangum had threatened to kill him with knives during their relationship and had displayed a pattern of violence. The prosecution portrayed Mangum not as a victim, but as someone with a history of volatile, aggressive behavior, who'd stabbed Day in rage, not self-defense. The jury also heard about the circumstances surrounding Day's hospitalization and death. While Mangum's defense team would later argue that medical errors contributed to his passing, prosecutors maintained that the stab wound set in motion the chain of events that killed him. Under North Carolina law, that made Mangum legally responsible for his death, regardless of intervening factors. On November 22, 2013, after just over 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Day's family wept with relief. Mangum supporters expressed outrage, convinced the Duke lacrosse scandal had influenced the outcome despite Judge Paul Ridgway's instructions. Mangum herself appeared stunned as reality set in. During sentencing, Day's sister, Shantia Lawrence, spoke directly to the judge. She described Reginald as a good man who didn't deserve what happened to him. She asked for the maximum punishment, saying Mangum had shown no remorse. The judge agreed, sentencing Mangum to serve between 14 years and 2 months and 18 years behind bars. She was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, her fate sealed. The aftermath sparked debate about the role of Mangum's past in her present. Durham County Assistant District Attorney Charlene Franks insisted the trial was about Reginald Day, not the Duke lacrosse case. She argued the jury had heard the evidence and made their decision based on facts, not bias. But Mangum's supporters continued to maintain she'd been denied justice because of who she was and what she'd been involved in years earlier. In 2019, a report from renowned pathologist Dr. Cyril Wecht raised questions about the cause of Day's death, suggesting medical staff may have accidentally placed a breathing tube in his esophagus instead of his trachea, depriving him of oxygen and causing brain damage. Mangum's legal team filed motions seeking to have her conviction overturned based on this new information, but courts denied the requests. The conviction stood. Then, in December 2024, came the bombshell. Crystal Mangum appeared on a podcast and admitted she'd lied about the Duke lacrosse allegations. She confessed to fabricating the assault, saying she'd sought validation and betrayed the trust of those who'd believed her. She apologized to the 3 men she'd falsely accused, acknowledging they hadn't deserved what she'd put them through. The confession closed a chapter that had remained open for nearly 2 decades, though it could never undo the damage. Today, Crystal Mangum remains incarcerated at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women, scheduled for release in February 2026. Her case serves as a complex cautionary tale about credibility, consequences, and the long shadow of past actions. Reginald Day's family continues to mourn a man whose life was cut short over an argument that should never have turned deadly. But if you think one person lying to police is shocking, consider what happens when someone creates an elaborate alibi involving security cameras, multiple states, and a timeline so suspicious it takes 2 trials to untangle the truth. Case 6, Jason Young, when a pregnant mother was found beaten to death in her own bedroom. While her toddler wandered through blood-soaked rooms, investigators faced a question that would take years and 2 trials to answer. How far will someone go to escape a troubled marriage? On November 3, 2006, Meredith Fisher received an unusual request from her brother-in-law, Jason Young. He asked her to stop by his Raleigh home to pick up some eBay printouts from the home office, supposedly information about Coach handbags he'd been browsing for an anniversary gift. Jason explained he was out of town on business and worried his wife, Michelle, might find the papers and ruin the surprise. Meredith agreed to help. When Meredith entered the house that afternoon, she found a nightmare. 29-year-old Michelle Young lay dead in the master bedroom, face down in a massive pool of blood. She'd suffered more than 30 devastating blows to the head with a blunt object. Michelle was 5 months pregnant with a baby boy. Nearby, under the sheets, Meredith discovered Michelle's 2-year-old daughter, Cassidy, unharmed but confused, asking what was wrong with Mommy. Tiny bloody footprints tracked throughout the upstairs, evidence that Cassidy had been wandering alone for hours. Police responded immediately, and suspicion fell quickly on Jason Young. The 32-year-old businessman had left the evening before for what he claimed was a business meeting in Virginia, followed by a visit to his mother in Brevard. He'd checked into a Hampton Inn in Hillsville, Virginia, that night and said he'd never return to Raleigh. But investigators found his alibi suspicious from the start. The couple's marriage had been troubled. Friends described their relationship as volatile, with frequent public arguments over minor issues. Many believed they'd only married because Michelle became pregnant, not out of love. 3 weeks before her death, Jason had told a friend he was done with the marriage. Michelle's mother, Linda, had been planning to move in with the couple to help with childcare, an arrangement that thrilled Michelle but infuriated Jason, who didn't want his mother-in-law living under his roof. Then there were the affairs. During the investigation, prosecutors uncovered evidence of Jason's serial infidelity. He'd been involved with multiple women, including Michelle Money, a former sorority sister of his wife's. There were explicit messages, secret meetings, and a pattern of deception that painted Jason as someone living a double life. His former fiancée even testified that he'd forcibly removed her engagement ring during their breakup, leaving her bruised, evidence of potential violence beneath the charming surface. The evidence against Jason was largely circumstantial, but damning. Hotel surveillance footage showed him checking in the night of November 2nd, but a camera in a side stairwell mysteriously went dark at 11:20 p.m. Unplugged, investigators believed, by Jason himself. A hotel employee discovered that an emergency exit door had been propped open with a rock during the night, a door that would normally remain locked. Prosecutors theorized Jason had disabled the camera, left through the propped door, driven the 3-hour round trip to Raleigh, committed the murder, and returned undetected. A gas station attendant testified that someone matching Jason's description had been at her North Carolina station early on November 3rd, contradicting his claim he'd been asleep in Virginia. Computer searches on Jason's laptop revealed disturbing queries about head trauma knockout, anatomy of a knockout, and divorce in the days before Michelle's death. Investigators even suspected the couple's daughter had been drugged with over-the-counter medication the night of the murder, keeping her sedated while her mother was killed. Jason's first trial in 2011 ended in a hung jury, with 8 jurors voting to acquit and 4 voting to convict. The defense successfully argued that the lack of physical evidence, no murder weapon, no blood in Jason's car or hotel room, unidentified fingerprints at the scene, created reasonable doubt. Many jurors struggled with the timeline, questioning whether Jason could have traveled all that distance without leaving traces. But prosecutors were determined. In January 2012, Jason Young faced a second trial. This time, additional evidence was introduced, including testimony about a wrongful death lawsuit Michelle's family had filed in civil court. Jason had failed to respond to that lawsuit, resulting in a default judgment holding him legally responsible for Michelle's death. The judge allowed evidence of this civil finding to be presented to the criminal jury, a decision that would later spark appeals. On March 5, 2012, the second jury found Jason Young guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict brought tears of relief from Michelle's family, but sparked immediate plans for appeal from Jason's defense team. Superior Court Judge Donald Stevens sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. For Michelle's mother, Linda, who'd lost both her daughter and an unborn grandchild, the conviction brought a measure of closure, though nothing could fill the void left behind. Jason's legal battle continued for years. In 2014, the North Carolina Court of Appeals vacated his conviction, ruling that evidence from the civil lawsuit had unfairly prejudiced the criminal jury. The 3-judge appellate panel ordered a third trial. But in 2015, the North Carolina Supreme Court reversed that decision, reinstating Jason's conviction and denying him a new trial. The justices found that while the civil evidence might have been questionable, other evidence was sufficient to support the guilty verdict. Today, Jason Young remains incarcerated, maintaining his innocence while serving his sentence. Michelle Young's family continues honoring her memory through advocacy and remembrance. Cassidy, who lost both her mother and father in different ways that horrible November weekend, was raised by Michelle's relatives far from the home where tragedy struck. The case became a landmark in North Carolina criminal law, raising questions about how civil and criminal proceedings intersect and whether defendants can be prejudiced by one influencing the other. It also served as a reminder of how domestic violence often hides behind closed doors until it erupts into irreversible tragedy. Yet while some killers act alone, others bring family into their plans, as one father and daughter would prove when they claim to be heroes instead of murderers. Case 7, Molly Martens Corbett, when a widowed father fell in love with his children's nanny. It seemed like a fairy tale. But years later, that romance would end in one of the bloodiest crime scenes North Carolina had seen, leaving 2 families, 2 continents, and countless observers asking the same question: self-defense or calculated murder? Jason Corbett's life had already been marked by tragedy when he hired Molly Martens in 2008. The 32-year-old Irish businessman had lost his first wife, Margaret, to an asthma attack in 2006, leaving him to raise their 2 small children, Jack and Sarah, alone in Limerick, Ireland. He needed help, and 24-year-old Molly from Knoxville, Tennessee, seemed perfect, warm, capable, eager to provide the support his family desperately needed. It didn't take long for the professional relationship to become personal. Jason and Molly began dating, and within 2 years, they were engaged. In 2011, the newly married couple moved from Ireland to North Carolina, settling into a home in the Meadowland subdivision of Davidson County. Jason transferred his job in the packaging industry. Molly became a devoted stepmother, volunteering at the children's school, and coaching youth swimming. To neighbors, they appeared happy. An international love story with a bright future. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Jason had designated his sister Tracy and her husband David as legal guardians for Jack and Sarah in his will, a decision that reportedly upset Molly, who wanted to formally adopt the children. There were also tensions about finances, cultural differences, and Jason's desire to potentially return to Ireland someday. Some witnesses would later testify that Jason could be controlling and verbally harsh with Molly. Others insisted they'd never seen him be anything but loving. On the night of August 1st, 2015, Jason spent the evening with neighbors, drinking beer and socializing in a driveway gathering. Molly's father, Tom Martens, a former FBI agent, and her stepmother were visiting, staying at the house. Everyone went to bed that night, seemingly at peace. But in the early morning hours of August 2nd, everything changed. Emergency responders arrived at the Corbett home to find Molly attempting CPR on Jason, who'd suffered catastrophic head trauma. Paramedics immediately recognized the severity of his injuries: blunt force trauma from multiple strikes. When investigators processed the scene, they discovered it was one of the bloodiest they'd encountered. Jason had been beaten with a baseball bat and a landscaping brick, suffering fatal wounds to his head. He'd been struck repeatedly, far more than would be necessary to stop any threat. Both Molly and her father, Tom, were arrested and charged with second-degree murder. Their defense was immediate and unwavering. Jason had been choking Molly, threatening to kill her, and Tom had intervened to save his daughter's life. They claimed Jason had become increasingly abusive, that he'd attacked Molly that night, and that they'd used whatever weapons were at hand, the bat and brick, to stop him. Tom insisted he'd acted as any father would, protecting his child from a violent spouse. Prosecutors painted a dramatically different picture. They argued Jason had been planning to take the children back to Ireland, and that Molly feared losing them. They pointed to a $600,000 life insurance policy, naming Molly as beneficiary. The physical evidence, they said, showed not defensive wounds, but a sustained, vicious attack. Blood spatter analysis indicated Jason had been struck multiple times while already down, not while posing an active threat. There were over a dozen blows, far exceeding what would be necessary for self-defense. The children's statements became a focal point of controversy. In interviews shortly after their father's death, Jack and Sarah told social workers about Jason's anger issues and alleged abusive behavior toward Molly. But after returning to Ireland to live with their aunt Tracy, both children recanted, claiming Molly had coached them on what to say and threatened they'd never see her again if they didn't cooperate. The trial judge ruled those statements inadmissible, a decision that would later influence appeals. In August 2017, after a lengthy trial, a jury found both Molly Martens Corbett and Tom Martens guilty of second-degree murder. They were each sentenced to between 20 and 25 years in prison. The verdict brought relief to Jason's family in Ireland, but devastated the Martens family, who maintained their innocence and vowed to appeal. In March 2021, the North Carolina Supreme Court delivered a stunning ruling. By a 4-3 vote, the justices vacated the convictions and ordered a new trial. The court found that excluding the children's initial statements had been error, as those statements could have supported the defense's claims of an abusive relationship. Jason's family was heartbroken, forced to contemplate reliving the trauma of another trial. But before the retrial could begin, in October 2023, Molly and Tom accepted plea deals. Both pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter, a significant reduction from the original murder charges. In exchange for their pleas, prosecutors dropped the murder charges. With credit for time already served, over 4 years, they were sentenced to additional terms that would see them released relatively quickly. In June 2024, both Molly Martens Corbett and Tom Martens completed their sentences and were released from custody. The decision sparked outrage among Jason's family and supporters in Ireland, who felt justice had been denied. Tracy Corbett Lynch, Jason's sister, issued statements expressing profound disappointment in a system that allowed the people who'd taken her brother's life to walk free. The case became the subject of international media coverage, including a Netflix documentary titled A Deadly American Marriage, that explored both sides of the story. It raised difficult questions about domestic violence claims, the reliability of children's testimony, and whether defendants can game the system through strategic appeals and plea bargains. Today, Molly lives in North Carolina under probation supervision, attempting to rebuild her life far from the home where Jason died. Tom Martens similarly serves out his parole period. Jack and Sarah Corbett, now young adults, live in Ireland with their aunt's family, speaking publicly about their father's memory and their belief that his killers escaped appropriate punishment. The Martens Corbett case stands as one of North Carolina's most contentious criminal matters, dividing public opinion across two continents. To some, it represents a failure of justice, a system manipulated by savvy defendants who turned self-defense claims into get-out-of-jail cards. To others, it's a cautionary tale about domestic violence that happens behind closed doors, where truth becomes impossible to determine after the only other witness is dead. But while courtrooms debated legal technicalities in that case, another residence in North Carolina was hiding secrets far more disturbing, a place neighbors would come to call the House of Horrors. Case 8, Pazuzu Algarad. In a quiet Clemens neighborhood, one house stood out, windows blacked out, yard hidden behind fencing, and an aura of darkness that made even hardened police officers recoil. What authorities discovered there in October 2014 would reveal that sometimes the most terrifying monsters don't hide in shadows. They live next door. He was born John Alexander Lawson in San Francisco in 1978. But by the time North Carolina knew him, he'd become Pazuzu Algarad, a name taken from an Assyrian demon featured in The Exorcist. The transformation was complete. Filed teeth sharpened to points, face covered in tattoos, body unwashed for months at a time, and a lifestyle deliberately designed to shock and repulse. He claimed to make animal sacrifices, boasted of controlling the weather, and surrounded himself with outcasts drawn to his dark charisma. The house at 2749 Nob Hill Drive became a gathering place for society's misfits. Visitors described a nightmare inside: trash piled to the ceiling, animal carcasses rotting in corners, feces on the floors, and satanic symbols spray-painted across every surface. The stench of decay was overwhelming. Bloodstains marked the walls. Dead and living flies swarmed everywhere. Pentagrams and demonic imagery covered what little wall space remained visible beneath the filth. This wasn't just neglect, it was calculated degradation. Algarad attracted followers who felt rejected elsewhere. They engaged in drug use, self-harm, drinking blood, and rituals that blurred the line between performance and genuine belief. His girlfriend, Amber Birch, became his partner in chaos, someone equally willing to embrace the darkness. Together, they created an environment where normal rules didn't apply, and violence became just another form of expression. The first major red flag came in 2010 when Joseph Emmerich Chandler, 30, was found dead near the Yadkin River. Chandler had last been seen alive with Algarad, who initially gave a statement but then refused further cooperation. Authorities suspected foul play but lacked sufficient evidence to charge anyone. Algarad was eventually convicted as an accessory after the fact and given probation. A slap on the wrist that allowed him to continue his disturbing lifestyle. But Chandler wasn't Algarad's only victim. In 2009, two men, Joshua Wetzler, 37, and Tommy Dean Welch, 36, both disappeared after spending time at the Nob Hill house. Their families reported them missing, but with no bodies and minimal evidence, the cases went cold. For 5 years, those families searched for answers, while Algarad continued hosting his dark gatherings, mere feet from where their loved ones were buried. The breakthrough came in October 2014, when authorities executed a search warrant on the property. What they found in the backyard sent shockwaves through the community. Buried in shallow graves were the skeletal remains of two men, later identified as Wetzler and Welch. Both had been shot in the head. Forensic analysis revealed they'd been dead for years, decomposing beneath the ground while Algarad lived mere steps away. When investigators entered the house, they required breathing apparatus to withstand the toxic conditions inside. County housing officials immediately condemned the structure as unfit for human habitation. Photos and videos documented a scene beyond comprehension. Hundreds of satanic images, mold covering walls, animal bones mixed with garbage, and cages containing animal remains. One official described it as the worst case they'd encountered in their entire career. Algarad, 35, and Birch, 24, were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and accessory after the fact. A third person, Crystal Matlock, 28, faced charges as an accessory for allegedly helping bury one of the bodies. Warrants revealed that Algarad had killed Wetzler in July 2009 and that Birch had assisted in the burial. 3 months later, Birch allegedly shot Welch to death while he sat on a couch, with Algarad helping dispose of that body. The case attracted massive media attention. Documentary filmmakers, true crime enthusiasts, and journalists descended on Clemens, trying to understand how such horrors could unfold in plain sight. Neighbors expressed shock, though many admitted they'd suspected something deeply wrong with the house and its occupants for years. Some had called police about suspicious activities, but without concrete evidence, little action had been taken. Algarad never faced trial. On October 28, 2015, he was found dead in his cell at Central Prison in Raleigh. The death was ruled a suicide. He'd bled to death from a deep wound on his arm, though exactly how he'd inflicted it remained unclear. His death robbed victims' families of the chance to confront him in court and hear him explain why he'd taken their loved ones. Amber Birch pleaded guilty in March 2017 to second-degree murder, armed robbery, and accessory after the fact. Prosecutors detailed how she'd shot Welch twice in the head with a .22 caliber rifle as he sat helpless. She received a sentence of 30 years and 8 months to 39 years and 2 months in prison. Crystal Matlock pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact and received between 3 years and 2 months and 4 years and 10 months, with credit for time served. In April 2015, the house on Nob Hill Drive was demolished to cheers from relieved neighbors. Families gathered with lawn chairs to watch construction crews tear down the structure that had haunted their community for so long. The lot remains empty today, a reminder of the darkness that once existed there. The Pazuzu Algarad case forced difficult conversations about mental health, missed warning signs, and how communities should respond when they suspect something terrible is happening nearby. Algarad had a documented history of mental illness, diagnoses of schizophrenia, agoraphobia, and depression, yet had fallen through the cracks of systems designed to help. His mother had called police multiple times about his violent behavior, but interventions proved insufficient. Today, Wetzler and Welch's families continue mourning men whose lives were stolen by someone who saw murder as just another transgression in a life built on shocking society. The case has been featured in multiple documentaries, including The Devil You Know, which explored how Algarad manipulated those around him and created a cult of personality that enabled his crimes. Yet while Algarad's crimes shocked with their satanic imagery and calculated concealment, another North Carolina case would prove that you don't need pentagrams or filed teeth to commit unspeakable acts. Sometimes evil wears the face of everyday people making calculated choices. Case 9, Amanda Hayes. Some crimes are solved in moments, others unfold across state lines, revealing layers of deception that transform what seemed like a simple disappearance into a methodical execution and cover-up that spanned over 1,000 miles. In July 2011, Laura Jean Ackerson was preparing for what she hoped would be a turning point in her custody battle. The 27-year-old mother from Kinston, North Carolina, had been fighting for years to gain more time with her 2 young sons, whom she shared with her ex-boyfriend, Grant Ruffin Hayes. Laura worked as a graphic designer and had recently launched 2 new businesses, determined to prove she could provide stable support for her children. Laura and Grant's relationship had ended years earlier, never progressing to marriage despite producing 2 sons together. The custody dispute had been contentious from the start, with Grant arguing Laura was mentally unstable and Laura accusing Grant of substance issues. A temporary arrangement gave Grant custody during the week, while Laura had the boys on weekends. Both parties had undergone psychological evaluations as the court worked toward a permanent custody decision. On July 12, 2011, Laura received an email from Grant that surprised her. He asked her to come to his Raleigh apartment the following day to pick up the boys, suggesting a willingness to cooperate that had been absent from their previous interactions. Laura was excited, believing this might signal a thaw in their relationship and potentially strengthen her custody position. She made plans to travel to Raleigh on July 13th, then continue to Mississippi for other commitments. She would never make that second trip. Laura arrived at Grant's apartment in Raleigh as planned. Grant now lived there with his new wife, Amanda Perry Hayes, whom he'd married in 2010. The 2 women had a strained relationship, largely due to the ongoing custody battle and Amanda's role as stepmother to Laura's children. What happened inside that apartment would remain partly mysterious, but the outcome was undeniable. Laura Ackerson died there that day. On July 15th, when Laura failed to meet Grant for a scheduled pickup and didn't answer phone calls, family members reported her missing. Police began investigating immediately, and their inquiries led them to Grant and Amanda Hayes. The couple claimed they didn't know where Laura had gone, suggesting she might have simply left town. But investigators found inconsistencies in their statements and suspicious circumstances surrounding Laura's disappearance. The case took a dramatic turn when law enforcement in Fort Bend County, Texas, received a tip from North Carolina authorities. On July 24, 2011, Texas deputies were called to Oyster Creek near Richmond, where they discovered partial human remains. Over the following weeks, search teams recovered additional body parts, a torso, skull, thighs, and leg bones, scattered in the waterway. DNA analysis confirmed the horrifying truth. These were Laura Ackerson's remains. The investigation revealed a plot so calculated it defied comprehension. According to prosecutors, Grant and Amanda Hayes had killed Laura in their Raleigh apartment during a dispute, likely over custody issues. Rather than report what happened, they made a conscious decision to destroy all evidence. They used a power saw to dismember Laura's body, placing the pieces in coolers purchased specifically for that purpose. They then rented a U-Haul truck and drove the remains over 1,000 miles to Richmond, Texas, where Amanda's sister lived. Once in Texas, the Hayes couple attempted to dispose of Laura's body using muriatic acid, hoping to dissolve the remains. When that didn't work completely, They took the coolers onto Oyster Creek via boat and dumped Laura's body parts into the alligator-infested water, believing scavengers would eliminate any remaining evidence. They'd carefully planned each step, calculating how to make Laura disappear forever while maintaining plausible deniability. But mistakes in their cover-up led to discovery. Investigators recovered a machete and other tools from Amanda's sister's house, though the sister was never charged, and investigators concluded she had no knowledge of what was happening. Forensic analysis of the pinged Raleigh apartment revealed traces of blood and bleach, evidence of an extensive cleanup effort. The rental records for the U-Haul created a paper trail placing the Hayes couple traveling to Texas during the crucial timeline. Grant and Amanda were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. They were tried separately, and both maintained their innocence, though their stories differed slightly. Grant's trial came first. In September 2013, after hearing evidence about the methodical dismemberment and disposal, a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Amanda's trial followed in February 2014. Her defense team argued she hadn't killed Laura and had only helped dispose of the body because Grant threatened her. She claimed she was a victim of domestic violence herself, terrified of what Grant might do if she didn't comply with his demands. The prosecution countered that Amanda had been an active participant, not a coerced accomplice, pointing to evidence she'd helped plan the Texas trip and participated in the disposal efforts. The jury deliberated Amanda's fate carefully, ultimately finding her guilty not of first-degree murder, but of second-degree murder. The verdict acknowledged her role while suggesting the jury believed she hadn't been the primary actor in Laura's death. She was sentenced to between 13 and 16 years in North Carolina State Prison. But Amanda's legal saga wasn't finished. In 2017, Texas authorities indicted Amanda Hayes on additional charges related to tampering with evidence. Specifically, the attempted destruction and disposal of Laura's body on Texas soil. Though she was already imprisoned in North Carolina, prosecutors in Fort Bend County wanted her held accountable under their jurisdiction as well. Amanda agreed to face those charges rather than fight extradition. In August 2018, a Texas jury convicted Amanda Hayes of tampering with physical evidence to impair its availability in an investigation. Judge sentenced her to the maximum 20 years to be served consecutively with her North Carolina sentence. This meant Amanda would remain imprisoned until potentially 2045, ensuring she'd serve substantial time for both her role in the murder and her efforts to destroy evidence. During the Texas proceedings, prosecutors emphasized the deliberate cruelty of attempting to feed Laura's remains to alligators, treating a mother of two like garbage to be disposed of. Laura's father testified about the ongoing pain of losing his daughter, describing how the family had been denied even the dignity of a complete body to bury. The judge showed no mercy, noting that Amanda had been given opportunities to cooperate or show remorse, but had instead maintained her self-serving narrative. In August 2024, after serving over 13 years in North Carolina, Amanda Hayes was transferred to a Texas prison to begin serving her second sentence. She'll remain incarcerated there until at least 2044, by which time she'll be in her 60s. Grant Hayes remains in North Carolina, serving his life sentence with no possibility of release. Laura Ackerson's two sons, who were just toddlers when their mother disappeared, have been raised by relatives far from the horror of what happened. The boys will grow up knowing their mother was taken from them by people who saw her not as a human being, but as an obstacle to be eliminated. Laura's family continues honoring her memory through advocacy, ensuring her story serves as a reminder of how custody disputes can turn deadly when people prioritize control over compassion. The Hayes case became a cautionary tale about the deadly intersection of custody battles, domestic control, and the lengths some will go to maintain power over others. It showed how seemingly normal people can commit unthinkable acts when they believe they're entitled to get what they want, regardless of cost. And it demonstrated that even the most elaborate cover-ups leave traces, breadcrumbs that determined investigators can follow to ensure justice prevails. Yet, as horrifying as adult-on-adult violence can be, there exists a category of crime that shakes communities to their core and tests the limits of civilized punishment. And North Carolina would face that reality when a man's actions forced a jury to decide whether some acts deserve the ultimate penalty. Case 10, Jonathan Richardson. In July 2010, a Johnston County hospital received a frightened young man carrying an injured child, a scenario that appears routine until doctors discover the truth, and a case begins that will test North Carolina's justice system and force uncomfortable questions about evil, responsibility, and whether some crimes exceed the boundaries of human forgiveness. When 21-year-old Jonathan Douglas Richardson arrived at Johnston Medical Center with 4-year-old Tegan Skiba, he claimed the child had simply fallen off a bed. But emergency room physicians immediately recognized something far more sinister. The little girl's tiny body bore evidence of extensive injuries: cuts, bruises, burns, bite marks, and a severe head wound that would prove fatal. Medical staff contacted authorities, and what began as a concerning visit transformed into a homicide investigation that would horrify even experienced law enforcement officers. Tegan was the daughter of Helen Roxanne Reyes, Richardson's girlfriend at the time. Reyes had left Tegan in Richardson's care while she traveled to New Mexico for Army Reserve training. For 10 days, the child had been solely under Richardson's supervision, staying with him at an outbuilding behind his grandparents' property. During that time, Tegan endured what forensic pediatrician Dr. Sharon Cooper would later describe as child punishment. Doctors transferred Tegan to UNC Medical Center, but despite their best efforts, she died 3 days after admission. An autopsy revealed the horrifying extent of what she'd endured. The child had suffered 144 separate injuries across her 40-pound body. 66 of those were bite marks, evidence of sustained attacks over multiple days. She'd lost over 70% of her blood volume. Medical examiners determined she died from blunt force trauma to the head, the final blow in what had been days of systematic harm. Richardson was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, first-degree offense with a child, and felony child abuse inflicting serious injury. Johnston County prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty, marking the case as one of the most severe prosecuted in the county's history. The community reacted with shock and grief. How could anyone inflict such suffering on a defenseless child? Richardson's trial began in March 2014 in Smithfield. The proceedings were emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Seasoned law enforcement officers broke down on the witness stand, describing what they'd seen. Medical testimony detailed each injury in clinical terms that couldn't mask the horror of what Tegan had experienced. Jurors, court staff, and family members wept openly. Prosecutors' voices trembled as they presented evidence that tested the limits of professional composure. The prosecution built their case methodically. They established a timeline showing Tegan had been healthy and uninjured when her mother left. Witnesses testified Richardson had been alone with the child during the entire period her injuries accumulated. Medical experts explained that the pattern of wounds, old injuries overlaid with new ones, indicated repeated attacks over multiple days. Not a single incident. The bite marks were matched through dental analysis to Richardson's own teeth, placing him undeniably at the scene of each assault. Defense attorneys faced an almost impossible task. They couldn't deny Richardson had caused Tegan's death. The evidence was overwhelming. Instead, they argued he hadn't intended to kill her, claiming he'd shaken the child in frustration, causing brain injuries, and then waited too long to seek medical help. They presented evidence of Richardson's troubled childhood, alleging he'd been mistreated by his father and suffered from undiagnosed mental health conditions. They pleaded for mercy, asking jurors to consider that life in prison without parole would be sufficient punishment. On March 25, 2014, after just over 1 hour of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges. Richardson was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, offense with a child, and child abuse. The speed of the decision reflected how clear the evidence had been. But the sentencing phase remained. Would the jury recommend death or life imprisonment? During the penalty phase, prosecutors presented additional context about Tegan's final days. Johnston County District Attorney Susan Doyle described how the child had spent her last hours bleeding in a shed behind Richardson's grandparents' home, suffering unimaginable pain. Assistant District Attorney Greg Butler characterized the crimes as extremely wicked and shockingly evil, arguing Richardson was a sadist and a killer who deserved no mercy. They displayed Tegan's copy of the children's book, Good Night, Sleep Tight, Don't Let the Bedbugs Bite, noting the tragic irony that her biggest fear should have been something so innocent. Richardson's defense team continued pleading for his life to be spared. They emphasized that execution would not bring Tegan back and asked jurors to show humanity, even in the face of inhumanity. Life without parole, they argued, would ensure Richardson never harmed another child while allowing for the possibility of reflection and remorse. They reminded jurors that the death penalty is reserved for only the most extreme cases, though this case certainly qualified. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before delivering their recommendation on April 3, 2014. At shortly after 8 p.m., they announced their decision: death. Richardson showed no reaction as the verdict was read and was quickly led from the courtroom in handcuffs. Behind him, his mother and grandmother wept. Outside, Tegan's family expressed mixed emotions: relief that justice had been served, but recognition that no punishment could undo what had been done. Tegan's grandfather, Gerald Skiba, spoke bluntly to reporters. "The way I see it, he got the verdict today. He should be dead tomorrow," he said. "He destroyed my little granddaughter, and she's never coming back again." The family's pain was palpable, their loss irreversible. Superior Court Judge Thomas Locke formally sentenced Richardson to death, making him North Carolina's 153rd death row inmate. Richardson's legal team immediately began the appeals process, as is standard in capital cases. Over the following years, they raised numerous challenges to the conviction and sentence. They argued the trial court had made errors, that evidence should have been excluded, and that the death penalty was disproportionate. But in September 2023, the North Carolina Supreme Court upheld both the conviction and the death sentence. In a 6-1 ruling, Justice Michael Morgan wrote that Richardson had received a fair trial and capital sentencing proceeding free of prejudicial error, and that the death sentence was neither excessive nor disproportionate given the nature of the crimes. One justice dissented, arguing that while the conviction should stand, certain evidentiary issues warranted a new sentencing hearing. But the majority disagreed, finding the proceedings had been conducted properly and the punishment appropriate. Richardson remains on death row today, though North Carolina has maintained an unofficial moratorium on executions since 2006. Barring changes in law or successful appeals, he will likely spend decades imprisoned before facing execution. During trial, an unusual incident highlighted the danger Richardson posed, even in custody. a detention officer discovered a handmade weapon, a shank fashioned from a fingernail file attached to a toothbrush, hidden in Richardson's jail cell. Judge Locke ordered him shackled for the remainder of proceedings to ensure courtroom safety, a rare measure that underscored concerns about his potential for violence. Helen Roxanne Reyes, Tegan's mother, faced her own legal consequences. She was charged with negligent child abuse for leaving her daughter with Richardson, despite allegedly knowing about his violent tendencies. The exact disposition of her case received less publicity than Richardson's, but her role in failing to protect Tegan became part of the broader tragedy. The Richardson case forced Johnston County and North Carolina to confront uncomfortable truths about how society responds to crimes against children. It sparked conversations about mandatory reporting, the importance of background checks for caregivers, and how communities can better protect vulnerable children. It also reignited debates about capital punishment, whether the death penalty serves justice or simply perpetuates cycles of violence, and whether any punishment can truly be proportionate to such extreme harm. Today, Tegan Skiba is remembered through candlelight vigils, memorials, and the advocacy of those who refuse to let her become just another statistic. Her case serves as a permanent reminder that evil exists, that predators can wear ordinary faces, and that society bears responsibility for protecting those who cannot protect themselves. It stands as testament to why prosecutors pursue the most severe penalties, why juries deliberate over life and death decisions, and why some crimes test the very foundations of our justice system. Jonathan Richardson's name joins a small but significant list of individuals whose actions were so beyond the pale that North Carolina's legal system determined only the ultimate punishment would suffice. Whether that sentence is ever carried out remains to be seen, but the verdict itself sends an unmistakable message. There are lines that, once crossed, place someone beyond the reach of mercy. These 10 cases represent North Carolina's darkest chapters, stories of trust betrayed, violence unleashed, and justice pursued through years of investigation, trial, and sentencing. From calculated poisoning to satanic horror, from domestic disputes turned deadly to systematic cruelty against the innocent, they remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it lives next door, shares our homes, or wears the face of someone we love. And when darkness descends, only the relentless pursuit of truth and accountability can bring even a measure of light back into the lives forever changed by these terrible crimes.